I'll begin this afternoon session with a brief introduction. Welcome to the Canadian Institute of Forestry's National Electronic Lecture Program. My name is Sharon Young, and I will be hosting today's session. Today is Tuesday, March 4th, 2025, and this is the fifth session in the e-lecture series entitled Advances in Operational Forestry, Tree Planning, and Carbon Mitigation Research. The series is a collaborative effort coordinated between the Canadian Forest Service and the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers. The CIF-IFC is very pleased to collaborate and host these webinars. For today's session, we are pleased to have Phillips, who will give an exciting presentation titled Boreal Wildfires, Escalating Emissions and Carbon Management. To kick things off, Carly is a scientist with the Union of Concerned Scientists, where she works primarily with the Science Hub for Climate Litigation. Prior to this role, she held research positions with the Pacific Institute for Climate Solutions at the University of Victoria and Woodwell Climate Research Center. Her research interests sit at the intersection of wildfire, forest ecology, and carbon cycling. She earned a Ph.D. in ecology from the University of Georgia's Oldham School of Ecology. With that, I will now pass it over to Carly.
Thanks so much. And thank you for having me today. I'm excited to share a bit about my previous research looking at boreal wildfires, their emissions, and potential mitigation opportunities. Before I get started, my collaborators in this work, specifically Brendan Rogers and Peter Frumhoff, who are both at Woodwell Climate Research Center, as well as Molly Elder, an economist at Tufts University. And so today we're going to be talking about a couple of different buckets of questions that are going to characterize this problem, what we can do about it. And first we'll be talking about what's at risk, both in terms of the broader climate implications and specifically as they relate to boreal forests. We'll then be discussing what we can do about it, how much that will cost, and what this might look like in action. And so to understand what motivated our research here, we have to zoom all the way out from Alaska and Canada and boreal forests and take the perspective of the current state and trajectory of our global climate system. We know from the comprehensive reports produced by the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change that to avoid the worst impacts of climate change, we need to keep global average surface temperatures below 1.5 and well below 2 degrees C. What you see in this image here is from the UNFCCC's synthesis report from the global stocktake that happened in 2023. And what you can see here is that nationally determined contributions, which each country puts forth as their plan to reduce emissions, even with land use and the forest sector included, we are not on track to meet either of those goals, either the 1.5 with no or limited overshoot and the likely below 2 degrees Celsius of warming. And we know that these are impacts that these temperatures are leading to impacts that folks are feeling across the world in their communities, both like wildfires, like we're seeing in Canada and Alaska and across the Western United States, as well as sea level rise in small island nations. And so what we wanted to do with this research here was investigate how boreal wildfires and their projected escalation in burned area and as a result emissions might contribute to these future emissions and how those emissions would fit into the broader context of these global policy goals and specifically into the global carbon budgets that have been constructed that allow us to meet these different goals. And that brings us to the land sector, which is already an important part of the global carbon cycle. It currently removes about 30% of total fossil fuel emissions from the atmosphere every year, but the capacity of the land sector to do so and to store carbon is changing rapidly in response to climate change. So as a quick overview of how this process is happening, we know that plants are removing carbon from the atmosphere via photosynthesis. This carbon is then stored in their biomass and in the soil. And then carbon is also released via decomposition in these systems. But the impacts of climate change are disrupting these processes across the board. Warmer temperatures and drought are impacting plants' capacity to remove carbon. Drought and beetle outbreaks and disease have changed the way our ecosystems are able to store carbon. And these processes are also leading to enhanced decomposition or combustion, like we're going to talk about later on, that have changed the way that these ecosystems are operating with relation to the carbon cycle. And I think outside of the land sector, it's important to note that we're focusing on the impacts of wildfire today, which carbon is only one impact, and certainly not the one that's often most thought of when we think about wildfires. Wildfires harm our communities directly, leading to evacuations, leading to smoke inhalation and public health concerns that result from that, not to mention the economic disruptions and the other ways that that wildfires can have lasting legacies in our communities. All of those are really critical. Today, we're going to be focusing specifically on carbon for the purposes of sharing this research that I led. And so we'll start by zooming to the boreal ecoregion. You can see the boreal forest. We have forest cover, which is the shaded green in the figure that you see, and the boreal forest that's outlined in the darker green throughout North America. These forests extend into Eurasia as well, but this research is focused specifically on boreal forests in Canada, with a specific focus in the later parts of this research in Alaska. And we've lumped all of these into one biome, but I want to make sure that I address that there's huge diversity within these forests, particularly within the Canadian ones. And that our goal here is looking at the larger patterns that are emerging from this biome, in particular because this Arctic boreal zone is warming between 2 and 4 times faster than the rest of the world, which is leading to consequences that we are already seeing today, from earlier snow melt to drier duff layers and drier soil, which can increase flammability. But warming is also projected to lead to more frequent lightning strikes in the Arctic boreal zone, which is the primary ignition source for many boreal wildfires, leading to concerns about the fate of the carbon in these ecosystems that's resulting from warming and the cascading effects of that warming on other parts of the system. And part of the reason that this is so crucial to understand is because these boreal ecosystems store huge amounts of carbon, primarily in organic soil and in permafrost. This figure here shows terrestrial ecosystem carbon storage, where darker brown tones indicate greater ecosystem carbon storage. And you can see in this red box that I've outlined to try to mimic the area of or to indicate rather the area of the boreal and Arctic zone, that the darker shading is really concentrated in that area, which again is primarily driven by below ground carbon in organic soil and then permafrost, which is underlaying that organic soil. And we know that this carbon is vulnerable to disturbances of many kinds, including wildfires, which are escalating across the region. And so in this figure, we can see, which was created right after Canada's 2023 wildfires by colleagues at Woodwell Climate Research Center. And you can see here we have million hectares burned on the y-axis and a year on the x. We have the red color showing burned area in Canada and the orange, which is showing burned area in Alaska. And this figure shows not only how exceptional 2023 was as far as burned area is concerned, but it also shows the rising trend of burned area. And as a result, you can infer the emissions that come along with that, which we'll talk about later in the presentation. But I also think in the context of this figure and in the context of the larger presentation, that it's important to note that while fire is increasing, fire has been a part of these ecosystems for many thousands of years. But in the past few decades, we've seen marked increases in not only the area burned, but also the severity of these fires. So boreal forests are broadly adapted to stand replacing fires that come through relatively infrequently, with a fire return interval of anywhere between 70 to 120, 150 years. Now, Indigenous communities that have lived in the boreal forest for millennia have also acted as fire stewards. in their stewardship of the land, using fire in the early spring season, for instance, when the vegetation may be dry, but the ground could still be wet, to clear that land. But even with that fire history, we're still seeing these marked increases in burned area and in severity that have profoundly changed the way that these ecosystems function, particularly when it comes to carbon cycling. A recent study by researchers at Woodwell found that wildfires largely offset the spatially variable Arctic boreal carbon sink, and that's particularly true in Alaska. And we've seen other feedbacks of these wildfires as well. It's also important to note, in the broader context of a wildfire discussion, that boreal wildfires are really different from wildfires that are occurring in part of in other ecosystem types. For instance, in BC or in the Western United States, in the forests of Oregon and Washington, where the fire regime is very broadly one of high frequency and low severity fires, where in the boreal system, we're seeing broadly low frequency stand replacing fires. And this distinction can often get muddled in popular conversations around wildfire, but making sure that this distinction is clear is key when we're thinking about how we might want to address increasing wildfires and their impacts, particularly as it relates to forest management. Forest management in some of these other types of forests in, like I said, British Columbia, Washington, and Oregon, removing overgrowth, doing prescribed burns to remove that excess vegetation, are likely to not have the same impact in the boreal system, given the distinct fire regime that's there. Fuel breaks, however, including those that include co-benefits like food production or recreation, are particularly valuable in rural communities. And there's a group that's investigating this that's led by Jill Johnstone and Michelle Mack that are exploring this fuel break intervention as a way to protect communities from the escalating impacts of these wildfires. But moving back to carbon, excuse the simplicity of this graphic here. I had a colleague who suggested that the 1990s called and asked for their graphic back. But I think what this does is illustrate the few key mechanisms by which fire can lead to carbon emissions in boreal forests. In our generic boreal forest here, we have some conifer trees, a thick organic soil, mineral soil, all of which is underlain by permafrost. And if we add fire to that system, particularly the stand replacing fire, we're getting carbon emissions from a couple of different sources. We're getting carbon emissions from the combustion of biomass, from the trees and the vegetation themselves. You can see that the organic layer has shrunk here. In some cases, we're seeing fires so severe that it's burning through the entire organic layer, which has an insulating effect for permafrost. And you can see here, again, apologies for the simplicity, the permafrost is thawing, which can also lead to additional carbon emissions. And these can occur at a variety of different times after the fire. We have that initial pulse of emissions that occurs during and immediately after the fire, but some of these emissions may continue for several years following a wildfire event. And so in this research, what we wanted to understand was what was at risk as far as future fire emissions from boreal forests are concerned, and specifically how that fits into the overall context of carbon budgets and temperature goals as outlined in important global agreements like the Paris Agreement, where governments around the world agreed to work to keep temperatures below 1.5 or 2 degrees C. And so we'll start by talking about how we tried to quantify what's at risk. And this involved projecting future emissions from boreal wildfires. And so we used a meta-analysis approach to allow us to understand how in both Canada and Alaska's boreal forests, emissions would occur out to 2050. And we chose 2050 because that's a really policy relevant timeframe. It's the point at which the IPCC says that we need to be at net zero emissions in order to meet those temperature goals. And so as we filtered through papers that met several of our keywords and search terms, we ended up with 21 papers that projected burned area in Canada and Alaska's boreal forests. And then on top of that, we used field measurements from Alaska, the Northwest Territories, and Saskatchewan to understand the combustion rate, the amount of carbon that's coming out of the system as it relates to a meter squared that would burn, and then use boreal specific emission factors to quantify the proportional contribution of CO2, how much of the carbon that's being released would be carbon dioxide. And our synthesis overall found that burned area by mid-century is projected to increase in Alaska by between 24 and 169%, and in Canada by 36 to 160%. And that's a wide range which captures the variability that we're seeing in the range of climate models that were in the papers that we used. And so this allows us to look at future emissions and project the gross amount of emissions that are occurring as a result of a wildfire event. But we also wanted to account for regrowth, which is key as part of the ecosystem carbon function and can remove a substantial amount of carbon, particularly over the long term. And so in making these projections, we used previous research by Jim Randerson and Michael Goulden to quantify net ecosystem productivity based on in situ measurements that had been made in boreal ecosystems. And so we did that so that sequestration didn't begin until 14 years after the fire. And over a 150-year period, as you can see in this figure, carbon accumulation roughly equaled the initial pulse of emissions, suggesting that the ecosystem would reaccumulate all the carbon that it had lost over that 150-year period. And so our projection showed that there's a substantial amount of emissions that could be coming out of boreal forests by mid-century. Our upper estimate was around 12 gigatons of CO2 that would be released between 2020 and 2050, or at the time of publication, what was roughly 3% of the remaining budget to keep temperatures below 1.5 degrees Celsius. And this is a conservative estimate for a variety of reasons, because there are factors that we didn't account for that are in both directions. So there's a potential tempering feedback because deciduous growth often regrows first after fire. That can be less flammable, and there's evidence to suggest that deciduous regrowth can offset carbon losses in its biomass. There are also changes to albedo that can impact the overall climate effect of a wildfire. But there are also potential amplifying effects. For instance, evidence of regeneration failures in some of these severely burned areas, as well as things like permafrost thaw, which we did not account for, and the emissions associated with that, as well as additional greenhouse gas release like methane and nitrous oxide, which we did not capture here. And we published this study in 2022, before the record-breaking wildfire year in Canada in 2023. And so in preparing for this presentation, I wanted to understand how emissions from that fire season fit in to these calculations that we had made. And so to include the emissions from that fire season on this figure, we would need to extend the y-axis threefold in order to capture them. And that single year exceeded the lower bound of our net emissions estimate and represented roughly 25% of our upper bound projection, which for me reinforces both how extraordinary that wildfire season was, but also the conservative approach that we took in creating these estimates. One of the things that we accounted for as part of these calculations was the emission from suppression efforts. We wondered if the jet fuel and the gasoline that are used during fire suppression might produce a similarly large amount of carbon dioxide emissions. And so while we didn't have specific data about the amount of fuel used, we did have data that looked at the costs of managing a given fire and managing and over an entire season. And even if we were to make some pretty large assumptions around whether 25% or 50% of those expenditures were spent on fuel, which with the fire managers we talked to was not realistic. That was a really high estimate relative to what's usually used. We found that emissions associated with suppression efforts were negligible, were less than 1% of the average annual emissions from wildfire, which confirmed for us and our research team that, again, they were negligible relative to the wildfires themselves. And so as a result of that, we identified the risk of huge emissions, which in light of the 2023 fire season are in fact even greater than what our calculations showed. And we were left with the question of, what can we do about it? And so for this part of the research, we narrowed in on Alaska and looked at fire management in Alaska. And we wanted to capture specifically how existing fire management strategies changed fire on the landscape, understanding that there are many factors that go into a given ignition, a given wildfire spread, as well as any given response to that fire. We used these fire management options or fire management zones, which you can see in different colors in this map of Alaska here, which determine how agencies action a fire that begins in or nearby any of these spatial areas. And we chose Alaska to narrow in on the question of the impact of management on fire size in particular, due to data availability and existing relationships that some collaborators had with the fire management community there. And so to quickly go over how fire management in Alaska works, fires in the critical zone, which is in red in this image, you can see a faint bit of red right around Fairbanks. The areas in critical suppression zone are quite small, but those receive the quickest and most aggressive suppression, and they often threaten human life, inhabited structures, and landmarks. And on the opposite end, fires in the limited zone are usually monitored without intervention, as they're usually pretty far from human development, and the values at risk are lower priority relative to the expense and effort of protection. Full and modified are intermediate suppression zones and may threaten uninhabited property, but are the intermediate suppression zones. And so you can imagine that a fire in a critical zone would receive a quick response and an aggressive suppression attempt, while limited may not receive any suppression at all. But that varies very much year to year, depending on the intensity of the season and depending also on how resources are already being allocated across the state. And so that was the primary variable that we were interested in understanding the efficacy of management in this specific carbon context. And so we used fire history data. We used just over 3,400 fires. And we chose fires that burned between June 1st and August 31st from 2000 to 2018. And we parameterized our random forest model using ecoregion, which you can see here in the blue in the map of Alaska, as well as fire history data, vegetation, fire weather, the cause, the duration, among several other variables to account for potential contributors to both ignition, spread, and suppression efforts to reach it. And so what we found was not surprising that fires on average are smaller in areas designated for the greatest protection. The fire management zone at the point of origin was the 5th most predictive variable for fire size, with maximum temperature, mean temperature, depth moisture code, and fire cause ranking as the more important predictors. This made sense for us in terms of how we know this ecosystem functions. And the partial dependence plots that we did as part of this analysis indicated a negative relationship between suppression effort and fire size. And so these were consistent with past work showing that final fire size at the time, predicting final fire size at the time of ignition over-predicted the final fire size in areas that were targeted for more intensive fire management. And so if we're thinking about fire suppression in boreal forests, not to go below historical levels, but to bring the burned area in line with historical levels, what we wanted to understand as part of this broader policy conversation was how much this will cost. Fire management and fire suppression are both hugely expensive endeavors, and carbon management is not factored into these decisions at all. The resources are rightly put towards protecting human life and protecting other values at risk. But what we wanted to understand is, in the context of these other climate mitigation strategies, how fire management factored into those as a potential policy choice, to see if spending reduced burned area and to understand the cost of averted emissions as a result of spending on fire suppression. And so the first big question we wanted to answer was, can greater spending reduce burned area? And we wanted to also estimate the effect of increased spending on fire size. And so we chose the years 2007 to 2015 based on data availability, and the annual fire season expenditures for fire seasons in Alaska during that time ranged from 40 million to 303 million. So capturing those seasons really allowed us to get a large range of types of fire seasons and intensities of fire seasons. We used a two-stage instrument variable approach, which I learned about as part of this work. I'm an ecologist by training, but this is a fairly standard method for this kind of economic analysis. And we used fire management option. Again, the critical, full, modified, or limited designation as our instrument. And what we found as part of this is that a 1% increase in spending reduced fire size by roughly 0.2%. So there is a relationship between those two variables, suggesting that spending more could decrease fire size. And we also wanted to quantify the cost of averted emissions, particularly as a way to understand boreal carbon management within that greater policy context. And so, using the results from the analysis I just mentioned, we were able to use per hectare carbon dioxide emissions and the costs and total area of the fires that were within that 2007 to 2015 range, like I mentioned, and we're able to construct a hectare-weighted average of the cost per metric ton of carbon dioxide emissions avoided through expenditures. And as part of this, we also evaluated the cost of these averted emissions in fires that ignited near roads and those in roadless areas to account for the cost difference in the suppression effort required with those different types of approaches. And so what we found is that on average, averting 1 ton of wildfire carbon dioxide emissions in Alaska's boreal forests costs roughly $12. And we wanted to compare that to climate mitigation strategies that replace fossil fuels like solar or wind, where we're seeing the cost of avoiding CO2 emissions as $29 and $25 a ton. But we also compared it to strategies that pull carbon directly from the atmosphere, like afforestation and reforestation, which is estimated to be anywhere between $15 and $50 per ton of CO2, as well as things like direct air capture, which, given the newness of that technology, has a huge range between $100 and $1,000 per ton of CO2. And so what we found is that boreal fire management as a strategy is within the range of those other climate mitigation options, but also often lower than some of those climate mitigation options, which for us as a research team interested again in this global policy context suggested that this was likely feasible within that same policy frame, which really led us to the question of what would this look like in practice. And my collaborators, Brendan Rogers and Peter Frumhoff, who I mentioned currently work at Woodwell Climate Research Center, have been working with folks in Alaska and specifically fire managers at the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge to pilot a project that looks at how proactive fire suppression in this case can protect areas rich in permafrost, which are those colored yellow in the map. You can see there the black outline of the Yukon Flats National Wildlife Refuge and the yellow areas, which are those that are targeted for additional fire suppression to protect the carbon, the ancient carbon that's in that permafrost. This area is about 1.6 million acres. And they're testing to see if they can use fire suppression as a feasible climate mitigation strategy to keep carbon in the ground. And as you might expect, this project has been met with skepticism and criticism by some, but curiosity and enthusiasm by others. There's skepticism around the scalability of such a strategy, the implications for long-term forest health, and the diversion of resources to support this strategy. But this work is a collaborative effort among Indigenous residents, scientists, and managers of the wildlife refuge to understand if this is feasible on this scale beyond what the research suggests would be possible. And I think it's important to note in response to both the skepticism and enthusiasm that this is a pilot project and that we're not suggesting that resources be diverted from protecting human life or property, or that wildfire is reduced below historical levels of burned area, but rather using management to protect these specific areas that have a high carbon concentration. And the way that they're implementing it, if you remember the discussion of the fire management zones here, is that the premise of this pilot project is changing these yellow areas from limited, which are usually where if a fire ignites there, it's monitored but not actioned, to a modified option, a modified zone, where if early enough in the season, a fire threatens those permafrost areas, that fire will be actioned quickly when it's small as opposed to monitored, and won't be allowed to spread to a larger area. And again, this is designed to not require resources be diverted from other suppression and firefighting efforts, but rather as a way to preempt large spread within these high carbon areas. And there's ongoing research to monitor this pilot project, to understand how it's working, and what additional strategies or factors are not currently being considered that ought to be. And that's led by Brendan Rogers at Woodwell, as well as the Carey Institute for Ecosystem Studies that's based in upstate New York. These scientists are going to be mapping carbon throughout the refuge and identifying areas that are rich in carbon and at the highest risk of burning, so that this can be an adaptive pilot project and is key in determining if this strategy can be effective for climate mitigation. And so it's really exciting to see this research be put into action in this experimental way, and I'll be following it closely to understand how this implementation goes and what the potential outcomes are as a result. And so if there are questions, I'm happy to take those. This is my contact information, and I also have some acknowledgements there of folks who have helped us with this work. Thank you.
Thank you, Carly. That was a great presentation. Before moving on to the Q&A session, let's take a moment to fill out a post-webinar survey. I'm gonna launch it now. So there are 2 questions in total. You may need to scroll down to see the second question. Also, a reminder that this session is being recorded and the recording will soon be available on our open access e-lecture webpage. Well, it seems that we just got one question here. So Carly, if you're ready, here's a question for you. What data underlies the carbon emission estimates from fires?
Yeah, thanks for that question. We've used a couple of different methods to try to quantify this. We used the Global Fire Emissions Database at first, as well as the Alaska Fire Emissions Database. But what we ended up using as part of this work, those are great resources for these kinds of questions, but we ended up using field data from a variety of sites in Alaska, Northwest Territories, and Saskatchewan to really ground that in measurements, that were made in this ecosystem.
Thank you, Carly. Next question for you is for the $12 per ton of avoided wildfire emissions, how uncertainty is considered? For more costly measures like renewable energy, dollars spent without emission reduction with certainty, but this is not always the case for wildfire management. Fire can be less or more severe regardless money spent. So what's your comment on this, Carly?
Definitely. And that's something that we considered, and part of the reason that we used a range of fire seasons to understand that relationship. So I didn't present it here, but we do have an uncertainty range around that. So like $8.75 to almost $23 is the range that we were seeing as part of this analysis. And so your point about uncertainty in the actual implementation, that is something that we have thought about and that is being considered as part of this pilot project. But our results from a range of different intensities of fire seasons suggest that that $12 and the range around it is indicative and representative of the uncertainty and variability inherent within that.
Thank you, Carly. Moving on to the next question. Did you look at management options in high-risk years? Suppression seems to work to reduce fire size in a typical year or a year in which you have a dry spring but not average or wet summer, or a dry fall but wet spring. A bad fire year, even once a decade, seems to make up for all the reduced area attributable to suppression. Has this been modeled?
That's also a great question. And we did. The range of years that we had included several really bad fire years in Alaska. So for the first analysis that I presented from 2008 to 2018 included the bad fire years in Alaska of 2004, 2005, and 2015. And for the economic data, we didn't have sufficient data in those earlier years, but we did capture the 2015 fire season within that. So those are included, but your point is taken that a bad fire year can both swamp resources and change, like you phrased it, the reduced area attributable to suppression. So that's included as part of the analysis that I've shared here, but we did not target any specific years and see how the results would vary across that. But that would certainly be an interesting question to explore further.
Thank you, Carly. Next question for you is the science of quantification of avoided fire and carbon sufficient to support carbon credit development, aka dollars to found monies to fund additional suppression work?
Yeah, that's another interesting question. I'm not sure. I know that carbon credits are expanding in a really interesting space where more research is occurring. I don't know how they are evaluating the science that underlies those credits, but it certainly would be interesting to understand how something like avoided carbon emissions from wildfire could be incorporated into that. But I'm not sure about the thresholds that they use for including science there.
Thank you, Carly. Next question for you is, are you able to share the projected emission estimates until 2050? Yeah, this participant missed it early.
Yeah, the upper bound of it is around 12 gigatons of carbon dioxide across boreal North America, including Alaska and Canada. The lower bound for those net emissions is roughly around 2 gigatons of carbon. But as I mentioned, that has actually already been exceeded by the emissions that occurred during the 2023 Canada wildfire season. And we expect that, given that and the other factors that I described in terms of feedbacks and permafrost thaw, that those estimates are largely conservative relative to what's actually happening on the ground. And this work was published, you can find it, it was from 2022, it was published in Science Advances, and so there are more details about those specific estimates available there.
Thank you, Carly. There's one more question in the chat. For you, is there any analysis of the cost and benefits of wildfire resiliency efforts in the Boreal? Is any landscape planning being done to reduce fire impact across a Boreal landscape? Intuitively, the break-even cost of $12 per ton should support substantial fire break and thinning and attempt to develop a better commercial forest industry in the Boreal.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think one thing to note before I answer the question directly is that we were looking at the $12 a ton specifically with suppression efforts and not with other forest management interventions. So that only applies to those suppression efforts that are going towards wildfires. It would certainly be interesting. I'm not aware if anyone has done this work to look at some of the other options for managing forests, like you mentioned, thinning, fuel break development, that sort of thing, and how those would compare. But there's certainly value in looking at that research and looking at resiliency. As I mentioned, there is a group that's looking at fuel breaks with benefits and helping to brainstorm how to get those more integrated into communities. That's ongoing, but outside of that, I'm not aware of other efforts that are specifically looking at resiliency in the boreal forest.
Thank you, Carly. I think, just one more question for you. Can mixed plantation resist fire? Oh, Carly, you're muted.
Yeah. Can mixed plantations resist fire? I think, unfortunately, it really depends both on what's in that plantation as well as the fire conditions. I also don't think I'm the best person to answer that question, unfortunately.
I think that's all the questions we have for today. If anyone has any follow-up questions for Carly, please feel free to reach out to us and we will help connect you with her. All right, I would like to bring this session to a close if there are no further questions. Thank you all for participating in our CIF electronic lectures. And once again, thank you very much to Carly for the great presentation. Bye, everyone.